As the Catholic Church sex abuse scandal continues to make headlines nationwide, action the Archdiocese of New Orleans is preparing to make is making headlines here. Danny Monteverdi explains.
New Orleans Archbishop Gregory Aymond said Tuesday he will publish a list of credible complaints of sexual abuse by members of the local clergy. But Aymond notes the release will not be a quick one. In a statement, Aymond writes, quote, "The review of the files goes back at least 50 years to ensure the list is accurate and complete. We will publish the list as this work is finished. It will be sooner rather than later." Aymond's decision to identify members of the clergy accused of sexual abuse comes during a trying time for the Catholic Church. Our partners at the New Orleans Advocate recently reported on a $500,000 settlement the Archdiocese reached with the victim of sexual abuse that was at the hands of a deacon. Following were revelations about a Mid-City man who was sexually abused and raped at Jesuit when he was a boy. Elsewhere, more serious action is being taken. In Pennsylvania, for example, the state AG has convened a grand jury to investigate such claims. During a recent interview with Eyewitness News, Aymond said he would always cooperate with law enforcement if they ever came asking questions, something he says has always been his policy.
And I really think it's important for people who have been abused by the church, by a leader of the church, in families even, that needs to be dealt with openly and not be kept as a secret.
Danny Monteverdi, Eyewitness News.
Well, the Diocese of Shreveport, Alexandria, and Lafayette also plan to release similar lists. It's been more than 10 years since the Archdiocese of New Orleans has had a credible complaint against any local clergy.